The year was 2157, and Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Horizon, watching the strange world spin below them, its surface covered in dark metal structures that caught the light of the system's red sun, making them shine like old blood. And he knew right away that this was not going to be another normal day of exploration in the Outer Rim, where humanity had been pushing deeper into space for the past 50 years. Building colonies and mining stations wherever they could find resources or decent worlds to live on. The ship's computers had picked up the energy readings 3 days ago, when they jumped into the Kepler 442 system and found this world that was not on any of their star charts, a planet that should have been empty rock and ice, but instead showed signs of massive construction and technology that made their own ships look like toys made by children. And now they were in orbit trying to figure out what they had stumbled into and whether it was safe to send down a landing party. Dr. Lisa Carter pushed her way onto the bridge carrying her survey equipment and looking excited in the way that only scientists get when they find something completely new and potentially dangerous. Her red hair tied back in a ponytail and her green eyes bright with curiosity as she looked at the readings on the main screen and started talking fast about energy patterns and construction, materials that were unlike anything humanity had ever seen before. Captain Morrison, we need to get down there right now because these readings are showing technology that is thousands of years ahead of anything we have, and if we can study it and understand how it works, then humanity could make advances. That would take us centuries to develop on our own, and we might never get another chance like this again, because who knows when we will find another site like this one. Morrison looked at his security chief, Ryan Hayes, who was a big man with dark skin and serious eyes who never got excited about anything and always thought about the dangers first. And Hayes was already shaking his head and pointing at the tactical display that showed energy signatures moving deep inside the planet's structures like something was still alive down there after all these years. Sir, I do not like this at all, because those readings show that something is still active down there and we have no idea what kind of defensive systems or automated weapons might be waiting for us, and if this technology is as advanced as Dr. Carter thinks it is, then we could be walking into a trap that we cannot fight our way out of. But Carter was not going to be stopped by caution, and she kept talking about how this could change everything for humanity and how they had to take the risk because the potential benefits were too great to ignore. And engineer Kate Williams, who was standing near the back of the bridge with her tools and scanners, agreed that they needed more information before they could make any real decisions about what they were dealing with. Morrison made the choice that would change everything for humanity, even though he had no way of knowing it at the time. And he ordered a small landing party to take one of their shuttles down to the surface to investigate the largest of the metal structures, while the Horizon stayed in orbit ready to provide support or evacuation if something went wrong. The shuttle ride down through the planet's thin atmosphere was quiet except for the hum of the engines and the nervous breathing of the four-person team that consisted of Carter with her scientific equipment, Hayes with his weapons and armor, Williams with her engineering tools, and pilot Bobby Chun, who had flown more dangerous missions than anyone else on the ship, but still looked worried as they approached the landing site. The structure they chose was huge beyond anything humanity had ever built. A black metal pyramid that rose from the planet's surface like a mountain made by intelligent hands, its sides covered in symbols and patterns that seemed to shift and change when they looked at them directly, as if the metal itself was alive. And watching them approach, they landed the shuttle on a flat area near what looked like an entrance and stepped out onto the alien world wearing their environmental suits and carrying everything they might need to survive if something went wrong. The gravity was lighter than Earth normal, and the air was too thin to breathe, but their suits handled the environment easily. While they walked toward the pyramid, the entrance was an opening in the metal wall that was exactly the right size for humans to walk through, which should have been their first warning that something was very wrong with this whole situation. But Carter was too excited by the alien writing and technology to think about why the doorway would be built for their size, and Hayes was too busy watching for threats to notice the architectural details inside the pyramid the walls glowed with a soft blue light that came from the metal itself and showed them corridors and chambers, filled with devices and machines that looked like art sculptures made by beings with minds very different from human minds. Everything was elegant and flowing and beautiful in a way that made them feel small and primitive. By comparison, Carter started taking readings and measurements, while Williams examined the construction methods and Hayes kept his weapon ready as they moved deeper into the structure, following corridors that led them toward the center where the energy readings were strongest, and where they hoped to find answers about who had built this place and why it had been abandoned. They found the central chamber after an hour of walking, through passages lined with alien text that seemed to tell some kind of story in pictures and symbols. And in the center of the room was a device that looked like a crystal tree growing from the floor and reaching toward the ceiling, its branches pulsing with energy and casting rainbow lights on the walls around them. Carter approached the device with her scanner and immediately got readings that made her gasp, because the energy output was beyond anything their technology could measure. And Williams started examining the base of the device where it connected to systems that ran throughout the entire structure, while Hayes watched the entrances and tried not to think about how far they were from their shuttle. That was when the lights changed from blue to red and alarms started sounding throughout the pyramid. Not human alarms, but something alien and musical that still somehow conveyed danger and warning. And Hayes shouted for everyone to move toward the exit while Carter tried to grab more readings from the crystal device. The pyramid shook around them, as systems that had been sleeping for thousands of years suddenly came to life, and the alien writing on the walls began to glow brighter while mechanical sounds echoed through the corridors. And they ran for the entrance, knowing that they had triggered something that was far beyond their ability to understand or control. They reached their shuttle just as massive ships began appearing in the sky above them, decloaking from some kind of invisibility technology that made them seem to materialize from empty air. Ships that were larger than anything humanity had ever built and covered in the same black metal as the pyramid, their hulls crackling with energy weapons that could probably destroy the horizon. With a single shot, Hayes got them off the planet's surface as fast as their shuttle could fly, while the alien ships surrounded the horizon in orbit, and Captain Morrison tried to figure out how to handle first contact with a species that was obviously far more advanced than humanity and might not be friendly to uninvited visitors who had been poking around in their ancient ruins. Admiral Patricia Stone sat in the emergency meeting room deep inside the Terran Defense Command building on Earth, surrounded by the most powerful people in human space, and tried to process the report that Captain Morrison had sent from the Kepler 442 system 3 days ago. A report that changed everything humanity thought they knew about their place in the galaxy and their future as a species that was expanding across the stars. The holographic display in the center of the table showed the alien ships that had surrounded the horizon and the massive pyramid structure that the landing team had discovered, and every person in the room was staring at the images with a mixture of fear and fascination, because this was the moment that humanity had been preparing for since they first left Earth, but hoped would never actually come. President Alex Turner was a tall man with gray hair who had led humanity through the colonial expansion period and had always believed that they would eventually meet other intelligent species. But he had imagined that first contact would be peaceful and involve trade and cultural exchange rather than ultimatums and threats of extinction delivered by beings who called themselves the Vorthek Empire. The alien ambassador made their position very clear, Stone said as she activated the recording that Morrison had transmitted along with his report, and the room filled with a voice that sounded like metal scraping against stone, but somehow formed words that the translation computer could understand and convert into human language. Your species has spread beyond your home system without permission from those who rule this sector of the galaxy, and your expansion must end immediately or you will be removed from existence. Like the other primitive races that came before you and thought they could claim worlds that belonged to the Vorthek Empire. The message continued with details about how humanity had one standard year to withdraw from all colonies and outposts beyond Earth's solar system and return to their homeworld where they would be allowed to live as long as they never again attempted to leave. And any human ships found outside the Sol system after the deadline would be destroyed, along with any worlds that harbored them. Dr. Nathan Cross, who was humanity's leading expert on alien life forms, even though he had never actually studied real aliens before this week, stood up and pointed to the technical analysis that his team had completed based on the energy readings and visual data from the horizon, and his conclusions were not encouraging for humanity's chances if this turned into a military conflict based on what we can determine from the scans. Their ships use energy sources that are at least 1,000 years ahead of our technology, and their weapons appear to be capable of destabilizing planetary cores, while their defensive systems make our most powerful missiles look like toys thrown by children. And that is assuming they were showing us their standard military equipment rather than their most advanced designs. Colonel Danny Rodriguez, who commanded the Special Operations Forces that were humanity's elite military units, slammed his fist on the table and declared that humanity should start preparing for war immediately, because giving up all their colonies would mean abandoning millions of people and decades of progress. And he refused to believe that any species could be so advanced that humans could not find a way to fight them. We have defeated every challenge that we have ever faced as a species, from ice ages to plagues to wars among ourselves, and we have colonized 12 different star systems because we are adaptable and stubborn and too mean to quit when things get difficult. So I say we start building weapons and training soldiers and show these Vorthak what humans do when someone threatens our families and our homes. But diplomat Helen Brooks, who had spent her career trying to prevent conflicts between human colonies, argued that they should at least attempt to negotiate with the aliens and try to find some kind of compromise that would allow humanity to keep some of their colonies in exchange for accepting limits on future expansion, because a war with a technologically superior enemy would result in the extinction of their entire species. The debate continued for hours, with military leaders demanding immediate preparation for war, while diplomatic and scientific advisors urged caution and further attempts at communication. And President Turner listened to all the arguments while knowing that whatever decision he made would determine whether humanity survived as a spacefaring civilization or became another extinct species that the Vorthak had eliminated intelligence. Officer Maria Santos, who had been quiet during most of the meeting, finally spoke up and provided information that made the situation even more desperate, because her analysis of long-range sensor data showed that massive Vorthak fleets were already moving toward human colonies and positioning themselves for what looked like a coordinated attack on multiple systems. They are not waiting for our response to their ultimatum, because they have already decided that we are a threat that needs to be eliminated. And the year they gave us was probably just time for them to move their forces into position and prepare for a systematic extermination campaign that will hit all of our colonies simultaneously. The room fell silent as everyone realized that the choice between war and surrender might have already been made for them by an alien empire that had decided humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to continue expanding across the galaxy. And Turner knew that he had to make a decision that could save or doom their entire species. Reports were already coming in from the colonies about panic and evacuation efforts as news of the alien ultimatum spread throughout human space, and some colonies were preparing to fight while others were trying to organize refugee fleets to bring their populations back to Earth before the deadline expired on. New Austin Colony Governor Pete Warren was organizing the civilian population for evacuation, while also stockpiling weapons and supplies in case they decided to stay and fight. And the debates happening in the Colonial Council meetings were just as heated as the ones taking place on Earth, because nobody wanted to abandon the worlds they had built with their own Hansport Liberty colony. Had already declared that they would never surrender to alien threats and were calling for all human military forces to converge on their system to make a stand against the Vorthak, while other colonies were trying to negotiate separate peace deals that might allow them to survive even if the rest of humanity chose to fight. Dr. Amy Johnson, who was working at a research station on the edge of human space, had been analyzing the alien technology samples that the Horizon had managed to collect during their brief visit to the pyramid. And her preliminary findings suggested that the Vorthek might not be as invincible as they appeared, because all technology had weaknesses if you understood the underlying principles. Turner made his decision after consulting with his advisors and military commanders and considering the reports from all the colonies that were facing potential extinction. And he knew that history would judge him harshly if he was wrong, but he also knew that surrendering to the aliens would mean the end of humanity as a free species. We will not abandon our colonies, and we will not retreat to Earth like beaten animals. Because humans do not give up their freedom without a fight, and we would rather die as a species than live as prisoners in our own solar system. So I am ordering all military forces to begin immediate preparations for war, and all colonies to prepare their defenses, because we are going to show the Vorthek Empire what happens when they threaten the wrong species. The orders went out across human space within hours, and every colony began preparing for the war that everyone knew was coming. While military factories on Earth and the industrial worlds started producing weapons and ships as fast as their facilities could operate, because humanity had less than a year to prepare for a war against an enemy that had been ruling the galaxy for thousands of years. The Vorthek attack came exactly 1 year after their ultimatum expired, and their first target was Redstone Station, which was a mining colony on the edge of human space with 50,000 civilians who worked the asteroid belts and planetary mining operations that provided raw materials for the growing human civilization. And Commander Beth Taylor, who commanded the small defense force, knew that her 200 Marines could not possibly stop the alien battle fleet that had just appeared at the edge of the system. The Vorthek ships moved through space like predators that had done this countless times before and knew exactly how to destroy a human colony with maximum efficiency. Their black hulls crackling with energy weapons that made the space around them shimmer with power while they advanced in perfect formation toward the mining stations and civilian habitats that orbited the system's largest asteroid. Captain Roy Miller commanded the UES Defiant, which was the only military ship in the system and had been stationed at Redstone to protect the mining operations from pirates and raiders. But his cruiser with its plasma cannons and missile launchers was completely outclassed by the alien technology that could probably destroy his ship with a single shot from their main weapons. Taylor ordered the immediate evacuation of all civilian transports while Miller moved his ship between the Vorthek fleet and the colony stations, knowing that he was going to die but determined to buy as much time as possible for the evacuation ships to escape the system and warn the other colonies about what was coming for them. The first exchange of weapons fire showed humanity just how outmatched they were, because Miller's plasma cannons that could punch through the armor of any human ship barely made the Vorthek shields flicker, while their return fire cut through his ship's defenses like they were made of paper and left the Defiant's hull glowing red-hot from energy beams that seemed to ignore conventional physics. The alien weapons were unlike anything human military doctrine had prepared for, because they used energy types that human scientists barely understood, and could penetrate armor and shields that should have stopped them. While the Vorthek ships themselves seemed to be protected by defensive systems that made human weapons completely ineffective. Dr. Amy Johnson, who was stationed at a research facility on the planet's surface, had been studying alien technology for months since the first samples were recovered from the pyramid, and she was running scans on the Vorthek weapons as they fired on the human ships above her, trying to find any weakness or pattern that could be exploited. The evacuation was a disaster because there were not enough transport ships to carry all 50,000 colonists, and the Vorthek were not giving them time to organize proper refugee convoys. Instead, they began targeting the civilian habitats with weapons that turned entire stations into expanding clouds of superheated gas and debris. Taylor and her Marines fought a hopeless battle in the asteroid mining stations where they had taken defensive positions with portable weapons and improvised explosives. But the Vorthek sent down soldiers who wore armor that made them look like walking nightmares and carried weapons that could disintegrate human bodies with single shots. The alien soldiers moved through the mining tunnels like they had done this on hundreds of other worlds and knew exactly how to hunt human defenders who were using tactics and weapons that were thousands of years obsolete compared to Vorthok military technology. And they showed no mercy to civilians or soldiers who tried to surrender. Johnson's facility was one of the last positions to fall, and she spent her final hours transmitting every scan and measurement she had taken of the alien weapons and technology back to Earth, hoping that human scientists could find some way to use the information to develop better defenses or weapons that could actually hurt. The Vorthok's most important discovery was that the Vorthok energy weapons operated on specific harmonic frequencies that created resonance patterns in their target materials, and she theorized that if humans could find a way to disrupt those frequencies, they might be able to make their armor and shields more effective against alien attacks. The research data was transmitted to Earth just minutes before Johnson's facility was destroyed by a Vorthok orbital bombardment that turned the entire research complex into a crater filled with molten rock and twisted metal. But her sacrifice would eventually help humanity develop the weapons they needed to fight back. Captain Miller kept the Defiant in the battle until his ship was nothing but a burning wreck with most of his crew dead and his weapons systems destroyed. But he managed to ram his cruiser into one of the smaller Vorthok ships and proved that human weapons could damage alien vessels if they were delivered with enough force and determination. The destruction of Redstone Station was broadcast across the galaxy by the Vorthok as a warning to other species about what happened to civilizations that defied the Empire, and they expected the demonstration of their power to make humanity surrender immediately rather than face complete extinction. But the aliens made a critical mistake because they did not understand human psychology and how humans react when they are threatened with extinction, and instead of surrendering, the human colonies began preparing for war with a determination that surprised every other species in the galaxy. Admiral Stone appeared in a galactic transmission that was broadcast to every inhabited system in known space, and her message was simple and direct as she stood in front of images from the Redstone massacre and spoke to the camera with cold fury in her eyes. The Vorthok Empire wanted to show the galaxy what happens when you cross them, and they thought that destroying one of our colonies would make us surrender like all the other species they have conquered in the past. But they have made a serious mistake because they do not understand what humans become when you threaten our families and our homes. Stone continued her broadcast by showing footage of human military factories working around the clock to produce new weapons and ships while entire populations volunteered for military service and colonial defense forces. And she made it clear that humanity was not going to be another extinct species in the Vorthok's long history of conquest. You wanted to demonstrate your power to the galaxy, so let me demonstrate something for you. We are not the same as the other species you have destroyed, because when you push humans into a corner and threaten them with extinction, they do not surrender. They become something much more dangerous than you can imagine. The message ended with Stone promising that humanity would make the Vorthok pay for every human life they had taken at Redstone Station, and that the galaxy would learn what happened when anyone was foolish enough to start a war with the wrong species. And her broadcast was received by thousands of alien civilizations who had been watching the conflict with interest. Other species that had been conquered by the Vorthok thousands of years ago began to take notice of humanity's defiant response to the Empire's ultimatum, because no other civilization had ever fought back against Vorthok demands for surrender. And some of them started to wonder if these humans might actually have a chance of winning a war that everyone else considered hopeless. The Vorthok High Command was surprised by humanity's reaction to the destruction of Redstone Station, because every other species they had encountered had surrendered immediately after seeing a demonstration of imperial power, and they began to realize that they might have underestimated the psychological profile of their newest enemy. But the Empire had been ruling the galaxy for millennia and had destroyed hundreds of civilizations that thought they could resist Vorthok authority. So they ordered additional fleets to move toward human space and prepare for a systematic extermination campaign that would eliminate humanity completely within a matter of months. 6 months after the destruction of Redstone Station, humanity had transformed into something that the galaxy had never seen before, because every human colony and every person on Earth was now focused on a single goal, which was survival and revenge against the Vorthic Empire that had declared war on their entire species. And the changes that had taken place in human society during those months would have been impossible under normal circumstances. Dr. Nathan Cross had been working day and night in the secret laboratories beneath Terran Defense Command using the frequency data that Dr. Johnson had transmitted from Redstone Station before she died. And his team of scientists and engineers had finally made a breakthrough in understanding how Vorthek weapons and shields operated on principles that human physics had never encountered before. The key discovery came when Cross realized that the alien technology used quantum harmonics to manipulate energy at the subatomic level, which allowed them to create weapons that could phase through conventional matter and shields that could deflect almost any attack. But Johnson's data showed that these systems had specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited if humans were clever enough. Engineer Pete Warren, who had been working on Project Prometheus in the military research facilities on Luna, had used Cross's discoveries to develop the first human weapons that could actually penetrate Vorthok shields, energy cannons that fired quantum-disrupted plasma beams, designed to interfere with the harmonic frequencies that made alien defenses so effective. Working alongside physicist Dr. Claire Davis, who specialized in exotic energy systems, Warren had also created new shield generators for human ships that could partially deflect Vorthok weapons by creating interference patterns that disrupted the quantum resonance effects. And while the new defenses were not perfect, they gave human ships a fighting chance in combat. But the most important development came from an unexpected source when Captain Steve Harris, who had been a mining engineer before the war started, began developing unconventional tactics that took advantage of humanity's greatest strength, which was their ability to adapt and improvise in ways that more advanced civilizations had forgotten how to do. Harris realized that the Vorthak had been fighting the same way for thousands of years, using standard galactic warfare tactics that relied on superior technology and overwhelming firepower, but they had never encountered an enemy that refused to fight by the established rules of civilized combat. The turning point came at Haven Colony, where Major Tony Brooks commanded a regiment of human soldiers that had been nicknamed the Hellraisers because of their willingness to use any weapon or tactic that might give them an advantage against the technologically superior Vorthok forces that were advancing on their positions. Brooks and his soldiers had studied the destruction of Redstone Station and learned from the mistakes that had been made there, and they prepared Haven Colony's defenses using industrial equipment and mining machinery as weapons in ways that the Vorthok military doctrine had never anticipated. When the alien battle fleet arrived at Haven Colony, they expected to find another helpless human settlement that would be destroyed as easily as Redstone Station, but instead they encountered defensive systems that had been improvised from terraforming equipment and mining explosives that created weapons the Vorthak had never seen before. The humans had turned the colony's industrial infrastructure into a massive trap, using gravity generators from the mining operations to create localized gravitational anomalies that disrupted Vorthok ship movements, while chemical processing plants had been converted into weapons that sprayed corrosive compounds designed to eat through alien armor. Brooks and his Hellraisers fought the Vorthok ground forces using tactics that would have been considered barbaric by galactic standards, but were devastatingly effective against an enemy that had grown accustomed to fighting civilized opponents who followed predictable military doctrines. They used the colony's tunneling equipment to create underground networks that allowed them to attack Vorthok positions from unexpected directions, while improvised explosives made from mining charges created traps that could destroy alien vehicles and infantry formations. The most effective human weapons were not the new quantum disruptor cannons that Warren had developed, but rather simple explosive devices that had been hidden throughout the colony's infrastructure and could be triggered remotely to bring down entire buildings on top of Vorthok soldiers, who were not expecting such primitive but effective tactics. The battle for Haven Colony lasted 3 days, and ended with the Vorthak fleet retreating from a human position for the first time in the war. But the victory came at a terrible cost because 80% of the colony's defenders were killed and the settlement itself was almost completely destroyed. But the strategic importance of the victory was enormous because it proved that humans could hurt the Vorthak if they were willing to fight dirty and use unconventional tactics that took advantage of their enemies' expectations about how civilized warfare should be conducted. News of the victory at Haven Colony spread throughout human space and gave hope to other colonies that were preparing their own defenses against expected Vorthak attacks. And more importantly, it showed that the aliens could be defeated if humans were willing to become something they had never been before. The psychological impact on the Vorthak was also significant because their military commanders had never experienced a retreat from what they considered a primitive enemy, and they began to realize that humans might require different tactics than the ones they had used successfully against hundreds of other species. Major Brooks became a hero throughout human space, and his tactics were studied and copied by other defense forces. But he paid a personal price for the victory because the brutal fighting at Haven Colony had changed him into something harder and more ruthless than the mining engineer he had been before the war started. The Hellraiser's regiment was expanded into an entire division of soldiers who specialized in unconventional warfare and were trained to use any available resources as weapons against Vorthak forces, and they became the model for a new type of human military unit that fought without regard for the traditional rules of engagement. Dr. Cross and engineer Warren continued their research into Vorthak technology and began developing more advanced weapons that could exploit the weaknesses that had been discovered in alien systems, while also working on defensive measures that could protect human colonies from the devastating orbital bombardments that had destroyed Redstone Station. The victory at Haven Colony marked the beginning of a new phase in the war because humanity had learned that they could fight the Vorthak effectively if they were willing to abandon their preconceptions about civilized warfare and embrace tactics that their enemies would never expect. Other species throughout the galaxy who had been conquered by the Vorthak Empire thousands of years ago began to take notice of humanity's success and started to wonder if these strange humans might actually be able to accomplish what no other civilization had ever done and defeat the empire that had ruled the galaxy for millennia. But the Vorthak High Command responded to their defeat at Haven Colony by authorizing the use of more destructive weapons against human targets and ordering their military commanders to stop treating the humans as just another primitive species that could be easily conquered. 1 year into the war, humanity had become something that the galaxy had never seen before and would remember with fear for generations to come, because the species that had once been peaceful explorers and colonists had transformed into the most ruthless military force that had ever existed in known space. And General Lisa Murphy, who commanded the newly formed Terran Vengeance fleet, embodied everything that humanity had become during their war against the Vorthak Empire. The human ships that emerged from the military shipyards on Earth and the industrial colonies were no longer designed for exploration or defense, but had been built with a single purpose, which was the complete destruction of every Vorthak world and the total extinction of the alien species that had made the mistake of threatening humanity with annihilation. Murphy stood on the bridge of the UES Annihilator, which was the flagship of the Vengeance fleet, and watched as her ships prepared to jump to the Vorthak system of Kethmar, where intelligence reports indicated there were 12 billion alien civilians living on a world that had never been involved in military operations against human targets. General Murphy, the final preparations are complete and all ships report ready for the assault, reported Captain Nick Turner, who commanded the bomber squadrons that would be responsible for delivering humanity's newest weapons to the Vorthak homeworlds. Weapons that had been designed by scientists who no longer cared about the moral implications of what they were creating. Murphy nodded and gave the order that would add another 12 billion names to the growing list of Vorthak casualties in a war that had stopped being about survival months ago and had become something much darker and more absolute than anyone had imagined when the conflict first began. Execute the Omega Protocol and make sure that nothing survives on that planet. because I want the other Vorthic worlds to understand what happens when they threaten human children, and I want them to know that we will not stop until every single member of their species has been eliminated from the galaxy. The human fleet jumped into the Kethmer system and immediately began deploying weapons that would have been considered war crimes by the standards of civilized galactic warfare. But humanity had abandoned such concepts months ago when they decided that the only way to end the war was to ensure that their enemies could never threaten them. Again, Colonel Janet Stone, who had been developing biological weapons in the secret laboratories on Titan, led the deployment of viral agents that were specifically designed to target Vorthek genetics and would kill every alien on the planet within hours while leaving their cities and infrastructure intact for human colonization. Paul Martinez, who had once been a respected scientist working on peaceful applications of antimatter technology, now commanded the planet-killer devices that humanity deployed without hesitation against any world that harbored Vorthek populations. Regardless of whether those populations had been involved in military operations against human targets, the attack on Kethmor was not a battle because the Vorthek defenders had no way to stop weapons that operated on principles their science did not understand and could not counter. And within 6 hours, the planet's entire population had been eliminated while the human fleet broadcast their standard message to any surviving Vorthak forces in the system. This is General Murphy of the Terran Vengeance Fleet, and I want you to understand that what happened here today will happen to every Vorthak world until your species no longer exists in this galaxy. Because you made the mistake of threatening humanity with extinction, and now you are going to learn what extinction actually means. The systematic extermination of Vorthek worlds continued for months as the human fleets moved from system to system, using weapons and tactics that were designed to kill entire populations as efficiently as possible. And humanity no longer made any distinction between military targets and civilian populations because they had decided that the only good Vorthek was a dead Vorthek Captain Eddie Martinez, who commanded one of the hunter-killer squadrons that specialized in tracking down Vorthek refugee fleets, reported back to Murphy that they had eliminated another convoy of alien civilians who were trying to escape to neutral space, and his ships had used new weapons that prevented any survivors from reaching safety. General Murphy, we intercepted the Vorthak transport fleet at the edge of the Zeta Reticuli system and eliminated all 47 ships using the quantum disintegrator warheads. There were approximately 2 million aliens on those transports, but none of them survived, and we made sure to broadcast the attack so other Vorthak refugees will know that there is nowhere in the galaxy they can hide from human justice. Murphy acknowledged the report without any emotion because the deaths of millions of alien civilians had become routine statistics in humanity's campaign of total extermination, and she was already planning the next phase of operations, which would target the Vorthek homeworld itself. The aliens had attempted to negotiate a surrender several times during the past months, but humanity's response was always the same because they had decided that the Vorthek species was too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing, and any alien attempts at communication were answered with demands for unconditional extinction. Admiral Kevin Johnson, who commanded the largest human fleet that had ever been assembled, received his final orders from Murphy as his ships prepared to jump to the Vorthek homeworld of Zethtalar, where the alien government was making desperate attempts to organize some kind of defense against the human forces. Admiral Johnson, you will proceed to the Vorthek homeworld and implement the final solution protocol, which has been approved by President Turner and the Terran Defense Council. There will be no survivors and no mercy because this species chose to threaten humanity with extinction, and now they will learn what that actually means. The fleet that jumped to Zethtalar consisted of over 3,000 human warships carrying weapons that could destroy entire star systems and had been built using technology that humanity had reverse-engineered from captured Vorthek equipment and then improved with human innovation and ruthlessness. The Vorthak homeworld was defended by the largest fleet in their empire's history, but their ships were no match for human weapons that had been designed specifically to counter every defensive system the aliens possessed. and the battle was more of a systematic execution than a military engagement. Commander Julie Davis, who was in charge of the final bombardment of Zethtalar, broadcast humanity's last message to the Vorthok Empire as her ships prepared to destroy not just the planet, but the entire star system using weapons that would create a supernova and eliminate everything within several light years. This is Commander Davis of the Human Extermination Force, and I want the galaxy to witness what happens. When any species is stupid enough to threaten humanity with extinction, you showed us what war was supposed to look like, but now we are going to show you what hell actually is. The human fleet did not simply destroy the Vorthok homeworld, but used exotic weapons to destabilize the system's star and create an artificial supernova that would eliminate any possibility of the planet ever being recolonized. And the explosion could be seen from star systems dozens of light years away. The death of 12 billion Vorthok civilians on their homeworld marked the end of an empire that had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years, but it also marked the beginning of humanity's transformation into something that other species would fear for centuries to come. News of the Vorthok homeworld's destruction spread throughout the galaxy within days, and every alien civilization that received the reports understood that humanity had not just won a war, but had demonstrated their willingness to commit genocide against any species that threatened them. The few surviving Vorthok refugees who had escaped the systematic extermination of their species sent desperate messages to other galactic powers begging for protection from the humans, who had become something worse than the empire they had destroyed. But no species was willing to risk becoming humanity's next target. Murphy stood on the bridge of her flagship and watched the supernova that had once been the Vorthok homeworld while considering her next orders, which involved hunting down the remaining alien survivors and ensuring that their species would never again exist in the galaxy. 5 years after the war ended, humanity had become the dominant power in the galaxy, and every alien species that had survived the collapse of the Vorthok Empire now lived under the shadow of human military might and the knowledge that these former explorers had transformed into something that made their previous rulers look merciful. By comparison, President Linda Hayes stood before the Galactic Council in the chamber that had once been the seat of Vorthok power, but was now the center of human authority over dozens of star systems and hundreds of alien civilizations that had learned to fear the species that had answered aggression with complete annihilation. The ruins of the former Vorthok capital city stretched for hundreds of kilometers around the council building and served as a constant reminder of what happened to civilizations that made the mistake of threatening human interests, because humanity had not simply conquered their enemies, but had erased them so completely that only archaeological evidence remained of the empire that had once ruled the galaxy. The Terran doctrine is simple, and every species in this galaxy will understand it perfectly, Hayes announced to the assembled alien ambassadors, who sat in their chairs looking terrified and defeated while human soldiers in combat armor stood guard around the chamber. Any civilization that threatens human colonies or human citizens will face complete extinction. Not just military defeat, but the total elimination of their species from the galaxy. Ambassador Carl Wright, who represented human interests in negotiations with the surviving alien governments, had spent the past 5 years establishing treaties that gave humanity favorable access to resources and territory throughout the galaxy. And every agreement was backed by the implied threat of what had happened to the Vorthok Empire. The galaxy now operated under rules that heavily favored human expansion and development, while other species were restricted to their existing territories and required permission from human authorities before they could establish new colonies or develop advanced military technology. Dr. Susan Clark, who had been studying the psychological changes that humanity had undergone during the war, published her research in classified reports that were too disturbing for public distribution, because her findings showed that humans had not simply adapted to warfare, but had become something fundamentally different from the species they had been before the Vorthok made the mistake of threatening them with extinction. The transformation was not temporary or situational, but represents a permanent change in human psychology and culture, Clark wrote in her final report to the Terran Defense Council. We did not simply defeat our enemies, we became something worse than they ever were, and there is no evidence that we will ever return to our previous peaceful nature. Captain Eddie Martinez, who now patrolled the outer systems in his ship UES Retribution, represented the new generation of human military officers who had been shaped by the war and saw no moral difference between destroying enemy soldiers and eliminating entire alien civilizations that might someday pose a threat to human interests. Martinez and his crew were part of a military force that had been designed not just to defend human territory, but to ensure that no other species would ever again be foolish enough to challenge human authority. And their methods were efficient and absolutely ruthless. The meeting that would define humanity's future relationship with the galaxy took place when representatives from the Krillian Confederation requested permission to establish colonies in a star system that was technically outside human territory but was considered strategically important by Terran Defense Command Admiral Frank Cooper, who had replaced Admiral Stone as the head of human military operations, met with the Krillian delegation in a conference room aboard his flagship, where the walls were decorated with images from the Vorthak War, including footage of burning alien cities and the supernova that had destroyed their homeworld. You are considering whether to challenge our expansion into the Kepler 186 system, Cooper said to the Krillian ambassador, while activating a holographic display that showed detailed recordings of the systematic extermination campaigns that humanity had conducted against the Vorthak Empire. The aliens watched in horror as the display showed human forces destroying city after city and planet after planet using weapons that were designed to kill entire populations as efficiently as possible. And Cooper narrated the footage in a calm voice that made the images even more disturbing. The Vorthak started a war because they believed they were superior to humanity and thought they could force us to abandon our colonies and return to Earth like beaten animals. But they made a critical error in judgment because they did not understand what humans become when someone threatens our families and our future. Cooper continued the presentation by showing the Krillians what had happened to other species that had attempted to resist human expansion since the end of the Vorthak War. And the results were always the same because humanity no longer fought wars to achieve limited political objectives, but to ensure that their enemies would never again exist. We do not fight wars to win territory or resources or to force our enemies to change their behavior. We fight wars to solve problems permanently and completely, which means that any species that threatens human interests will be eliminated from the galaxy. Just like the Vorthak were eliminated, the Krillian delegation left the meeting without making any demands about the Kepler 186 system, and their government issued a formal statement declaring that they had no intention of interfering with human expansion in any part of the galaxy, because they understood that challenging humanity would result in their complete extinction as a species. Similar meetings took place with other alien governments throughout the galaxy, and the results were always the same because every species that had survived the collapse of the Vorthak Empire understood that humanity had become something that made their previous rulers look restrained, and merciful children on human colonies and on Earth learned about the war in schools where teachers explained that humanity had been forced to become something they had never wanted to be, because other species had threatened them with extinction and left them no choice but to respond with overwhelming force. Miss Rachel Davis, who taught history at the new Terra colony school, stood before her class of 8-year-old students and explained the lessons of the Vorthak War using simple language that children could understand, but conveyed the essential truth about what humanity had become. Remember that we did not choose to become what we are today because we were peaceful explorers who wanted to share the galaxy with other intelligent species. But the Vorthak Empire decided that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed to continue existing, and they tried to destroy us completely. Davis continued her lesson by explaining that humanity's response to the alien threat had been necessary for their survival, but had changed them into something that other species would always fear, and that this transformation was the price they had paid for ensuring that no one would ever again threaten human children or human families. The galaxy made us into what we are today, and now every alien species has to live with the consequences of what they created when they allowed the Vorthek to threaten us with extinction. And we will never again allow anyone to make us feel helpless or afraid. The final scene showed the graduation ceremony at the Terran Defense Academy, where young humans were trained to become the military officers who would ensure that humanity remained the dominant power in the galaxy. And the oath they swore was simple and direct: we swear to protect humanity from all threats, foreign and domestic, and to ensure that no species will ever again be foolish enough to challenge human authority, and we will accomplish this mission by any means necessary, regardless of the cost to ourselves or to our enemies.